On April 12th, 2026, something happened that most people said was impossible. After 16 years of iron grip control, after 4 consecutive election wins, after building what critics called the EU's first authoritarian state, Viktor Orbán lost. The man who rewrote the Hungarian constitution to keep himself in power. The man who made Trump look like a moderate. The man Vladimir Putin called a true friend inside the European Union. Gone. Just like that. But here's the question nobody in the media is actually asking. Not, how did Orbán lose? We know that story. The real question is, what did 16 years of his economic experiment actually do to Hungary? Because when you look at the numbers, the real numbers, not the propaganda, you get something fascinating. You get a story about an economy that was genuinely fixed, then slowly hollowed out from the inside. And now a new leader inheriting an absolute mess, with the clock already ticking. Stay with me, because this is one of the most interesting economic stories in Europe right now. To understand what Orbán did to Hungary's economy, you have to understand what he inherited. In 2009, the year before he took power, Hungary's GDP shrank by almost 7%. Public debt had hit 77% of GDP. Unemployment was above 10%. The country had just gone through a brutal IMF bailout. Ordinary Hungarians were getting absolutely hammered. So when Orban walked in with a 2/3 parliamentary supermajority in 2010, he didn't just form a government. He rewired the entire system. He called it illiberal democracy, which sounds like an oxymoron, and honestly it is. But on the economic side, it had a clear logic. He nationalized key industries. He slapped heavy taxes on foreign banks and multinational companies, taxes that domestic businesses didn't have to pay. He introduced a flat income tax. He poured money into family subsidies, one of the most generous family support systems in Europe. It was protectionist. It was nationalist. And for a while, it actually worked. After a rough patch in 2012, Hungary's economy started growing steadily. Unemployment fell, wages rose. Orbán could point to real results, and millions of Hungarians believed in him because of it. But here's the part that doesn't make the Fidesz campaign posters. A huge chunk of that growth was powered by something Orbán never liked to talk about: European Union structural funds. Hungary was one of the biggest net recipients of EU money in the entire bloc. Billions every year, funding roads, buildings, factories, public projects. Without that injection, the economic miracle looks a lot less miraculous. And here's where it starts getting dark. Because as the years went on, Orbán's system evolved. It stopped being about building a strong Hungary and started being about something else entirely. It became about building a network, a very specific network of businessmen, oligarchs, and loyalists, all of them getting very, very rich on government contracts and EU money. And the Hungarian people? They got the crumbs. Now, let's talk about what the data actually shows. Because from about 2019 onwards, the cracks start appearing. And after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, those cracks become craters. First, inflation. In 2022, Hungary's inflation rate hit nearly 15%. In 2023, it climbed to around 17%. 17%. For context, that was the highest inflation rate in the entire European Union. Every single month, for over a year, Hungarians were paying more for food, energy, and basics than anyone else in Europe. Orbán's government tried price caps, slapping limits on what supermarkets could charge for basic food items. It was a short-term political move. It temporarily reduced the headline number, but it didn't fix the underlying problem. And when the caps came off, prices adjusted upward, fast. Then came the recession. Not once, twice. Hungary entered what economists call a technical recession, 2 consecutive quarters of shrinking GDP, twice in 2023 and 2024. And by 2025, the economy was barely growing at all, just 0.3%. For an economy that was supposed to be a regional success story, that's a humiliation. Then there's the forint, Hungary's currency. The forint weakened sharply against the euro and the dollar, which sounds like a technical problem. But for ordinary Hungarians, it meant that everything imported got more expensive. And Hungary imports a lot. It also meant that government debt denominated in foreign currencies got heavier every time the forint dropped. Which brings us to the debt. By 2024, Hungary's government debt had reached 73.6% of GDP. The budget deficit was sitting at almost 5% of GDP, well above the EU's 3% limit. And Hungary's debt servicing costs, the amount it pays just to service its existing debt, are now the highest in the entire European Union. Every year, a bigger chunk of the budget goes to paying interest. Less money for hospitals, less money for schools, less money for infrastructure. But here's the number that really tells the story. In 2024, Hungary's actual individual consumption per capita, which is basically a measure of what ordinary people can actually afford to buy, was just 72% of the EU average. 72%. That's among the very lowest in the entire European Union. Lower than Romania. Lower than Bulgaria. Among the worst of every single member state. This is the country Orban told the world was an economic model. And then there's corruption, which isn't separate from the economy. It is the economy under Orban. In 2025, Transparency International ranked Hungary at the very bottom of the EU on its Corruption Perceptions Index. The report cited, and I'm paraphrasing here, systematic failure to stop the organized theft of public funds. Orban's critics weren't just political opponents being dramatic. They had receipts. And you can draw a straight line from corruption to economic underperformance. When government contracts go to political loyalists instead of the most efficient companies, productivity suffers. When EU funds get redirected into friendly pockets, public investment suffers. When businesses can't trust the courts because the judiciary isn't independent, foreign investment dries up. This isn't theory. This is what happened in Hungary. There's one more piece of this story, and it's the one that made Orban genuinely dangerous. Not just to Hungary, but to the entire EU, Russia. When every other EU member was scrambling to cut Russian energy dependency after the Ukraine invasion, Orban refused. He maintained Hungary's reliance on Russian gas and oil. He blocked EU sanctions. He vetoed Ukraine aid packages in Brussels, sometimes for months, reportedly using his veto as a negotiating chip. The economic cost was real. When energy prices spiked across Europe, Hungary's dependence on Russian supply meant it had almost no flexibility. And the frozen EU funds, which Brussels withheld over rule of law violations, made everything worse. By 2025, all three major credit rating agencies, Moody's, S&P, and Fitch, had put Hungary on negative outlook. That's a signal to global investors. Proceed with caution. So, April 12, 2026. Péter Magyar and his TISA party won 141 out of 199 seats in parliament, a supermajority. The same weapon Orban used to reshape Hungary, now in Magyar's hands. And the question is, can he actually fix this? Let's start with what's working in his favor. The first, and biggest horror, thing is the European Union. Under Orban, Brussels froze approximately 17 billion euros in EU funds. Money Hungary was entitled to as an EU member, but which the EU withheld because of rule of law and corruption concerns. 17 billion euros. For a country with a GDP of around 200 billion. That's enormous. Magyar has made restoring EU relations his top priority. If he can unlock even a significant portion of those funds, and analysts believe he can, it's the single biggest economic stimulus Hungary could receive. The second thing, working in his favor, the markets believe him. In the days before the election, Hungarian bonds, stocks, and the forint all rallied toward multi-year highs. Financial markets were essentially pricing in a Magyar victory and betting he'd deliver. That kind of market confidence is genuinely valuable. It reduces borrowing costs and makes investment more attractive. Magyar is also talking about something that would have been unthinkable under Orban. Euro adoption. Hungary joining the Eurozone, giving up the forint, locking into European monetary policy. Now, this is a long game. To qualify for the euro, Hungary needs to get its budget deficit below 3% of GDP. Currently, it's hovering around 5. It needs to reduce its debt load and get inflation down to target. That will take years, possibly the better part of a decade. But by committing to the path publicly, Magyar is signaling to investors and the EU alike that Hungary is done playing games. And then there's the cleanup. Magyar has pledged to go after the oligarch networks that benefited from 16 years of Fidesz rule, canceling sweetheart contracts, clawing back misused EU funds, rebuilding an independent judiciary. None of this is easy. All of it will be contested every step of the way. Because here's the thing about inheriting a broken economy. Some problems respond quickly to good policy, and some problems are structural, built into the foundation, and they take a generation to fix. Hungary has a shrinking working-age population. People are leaving. Young, educated Hungarians have been emigrating to Western Europe for years, chasing better wages, better opportunities, a better quality of life. That brain drain doesn't reverse overnight just because the government changes. Investment also takes time. Hungary's investment rate dropped by around 20% in the 2 years before the election. Factories don't get built in months. Supply chains don't reroute in a quarter. The electric vehicle and battery manufacturing capacity that Hungary has been developing, which could be a real economic engine, takes years to fully operationalize. And then there's Orban himself. Viktor Orbán is not retiring. He called his defeat painful, and then immediately announced he would lead Fidesz from the opposition. This matters economically, because Orbán still controls significant media. His network of loyalists is embedded in local institutions across the country. He's done this before. He lost power in 2002 and came back stronger in 2010. Magyar doesn't just have to fix the economy. He has to do it while fighting a highly motivated, deeply organized opposition that built its entire brand on opposing exactly the things he's trying to build. No pressure. So, here's where Hungary stands in May 2026. A new government with a genuine mandate and a supermajority, 17 billion euros potentially unlocked. Markets cautiously optimistic. A leader who at least understands the problems he's inherited. And an economy that is genuinely one of the most interesting turnaround stories in Europe, if it works. Because here's the honest answer to the question I opened with. Can you dismantle 16 years of economic cronyism in one parliamentary term? Probably not completely. The structural damage is deep. The political resistance will be fierce. And the external environment, with Germany slowing, global trade under pressure, and the war in Ukraine still unresolved, is genuinely difficult. But can Magyar make a real dent? Can he unlock the EU money, rebuild confidence, and set Hungary on a fundamentally different trajectory? Yes, I think he can, if he moves fast enough, and if Orban lets him. Drop your take in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want to follow this story as it develops, because Hungary in 2026 is genuinely going to be one to watch, hit subscribe. We're covering Poland next, which faced many of the same pressures as Hungary, but took a very different path. I'll see you there.